Welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, hosted by Shane Rolf.
Hello and welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we explore a variety of topics related to bail, pretrial release, and the criminal justice system in the Midwest. My name is Shane Rolf. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Kansas Bail Agents Association, and I've worked in this field for the past 35 years. Now, I always find it interesting how much of English common law can be traced back to what most Americans would know as the time of Robin Hood. Prince John, later becoming King John, was forced to sign the Magna Carta, one of the first legal documents to guarantee the right to bail by surety, although only for freedmen, not serfs. This was one of the building blocks, however, of modern jurisprudence, the beginning of the people taking charge. Now, in the couple centuries before that, the Anglo-Saxons had officials called reeves, and a reeve could be in charge of various things, a town, a port, or a shire, which was an administrative district, not a village of hobbits. And ultimately, that official in charge of the defense of the shire, the shire reeve, morphed into the sheriff. And bringing us back to the stories of Robin Hood, Robin's nemesis was the Sheriff of Nottinghamshire, or Sheriff of Nottingham, which is still a county in England to this day, and there is actually still a Sheriff of Nottingham to this day. Now, over the centuries, the role of the sheriff has become more focused on law enforcement rather than tax collection, which is what we saw in the Robin Hood stories. And so virtually every country in the British Commonwealth, and those countries whose legal systems are based upon English common law, they all have sheriffs. In the United States, a sheriff is typically an elected law enforcement official who is elected as the chief law enforcement officer for a county. But probably the most important aspect of the job description of a sheriff is that he or she is elected, meaning that they are accountable to the people, not some mayor or county commission or king, but the actual voters of the county that they're elected in. My guest today is running for sheriff of the most populous county in the state of Kansas, Johnson County, Kansas, which is a suburb of Kansas City. Doug Bedford is the former undersheriff for the Johnson County Sheriff's Office, is a former Navy SEAL. For disclosure purposes, I've known Doug since the fourth grade when we were both in Boy Scouts. He was always the team captain of our football teams and has spent his entire adult life in public service. Doug, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Shane. I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Sure. Well, give us a little bit more backstory. I mean, I know that you're a lifetime resident of DeSoto, Kansas, which is a city here in Johnson County, and I believe your family's been there for at least a couple of generations. Do you remember that right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. My parents, they both moved here at a young age. My grandparents got a job, what was then the Sunflower, the Army ammunition plant, which is now under a little transformation, as everyone knows. They moved here. Like I said, my parents were 9 and 10 years old, respectively, and they grew up in DeSoto, graduated from DeSoto High. Aside from my dad working for the federal government and moving around a little bit, I was born in California, but moved back here and started kindergarten back in DeSoto. That's where I graduated. My wife graduated, and both of our kids graduated from here also. So I've been like you said, aside from a little bit of time, the 8 years in the military as a Navy SEAL, whenever I moved here at the age of 5, other than that, I've virtually been a lifelong DeSoto resident.
Well, let's talk about the Navy SEAL, because I mean that's really unique. So professionally, if memory serves me correctly, because I was involved in the bail bond industry from a pretty young age myself, so I was kind of around that Johnson County Sheriff's milieu.
Sure.
You were initially at the Sheriff's Office for a couple of years, and then you left to join the Navy, which is not really the normal career arc. So I mean, normally you spend some time in the military and then come out and go, oh, well, I'm going to go into law enforcement because of these experiences. But what made you leave law enforcement to want to go join the military at that time?
No, you're exactly right. I'd gone to college, played college football, joined the sheriff's office at 21, and I was a deputy. That was back when the jail was actually in the courthouse on the fourth floor of the courthouse.
I remember.
You remember those days. I worked there for 2 years, and so at the age of 23, for lack of better terms, I felt like I was having a calling. I felt that if I didn't at least spend some time in the military, try for a goal that I wanted to achieve, that I would regret it years later. And so I left for boot camp at 23. after, boot camp and A school or your MOS school, then I went to basic underwater demolition SEAL training out in Coronado, California. And so I was starting that at 24 years old. So I was considered kind of an old guy going through BUDS training. But I graduated BUDS training in July of 1990. I then went to SEAL Team 3, which is in Coronado, California, and I was there for the remainder of my enlistment, and actually a second enlistment. So I was there in the military for 8 years.
Well, you probably got more than you bargained for in that, considering, we had a pretty long, stretch and not a whole lot going on. And then suddenly, right when you get in the SEALs, then, along comes Desert Storm.
It did. It did.
I assume you were assigned in areas there.
Definitely. I was actually at jump school down in Fort Benning, Georgia, when Kuwait was invaded. And so normally after BUDS training, then you're going to get a little bit of time off. But I got back from Georgia on a Sunday, and on Monday, the command master chief at SEAL Team 3 called and said, you need to be back in a week. And so I was platooned up. We did a workup to go over to the Middle East, and then that was my first platoon. We were going over to, as part of Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the Gulf War. We worked in a number of different countries over there. Went to Kuwait, Bahrain, Dubai, Saudi Arabia, areas like that. And so it was a great eye opener right out of the gate.
So were you married at that time?
I wasn't. I did 3 platoons, 3 deployments overseas while I was in the SEAL teams. I actually got married about 6 months prior to getting out of the military. So I got married in October of 96, and then my enlistment ended in March of 97.
Because I could see your wife being like, wait a second, what do you mean you're going to war?
Well, and she was 100% supportive in anything that I did in the SEAL teams. If I was going to re-enlist again, I was going to set to be transferred out to the East Coast to a SEAL team out on that coast. She said, just let me know what I want to do. She's from DeSoto also. And so she said, let me know if I need to pack my stuff up and we're moving to Virginia, or if you're coming back here. And so it was a good team effort. We had a good discussion. And then I decided to go ahead and end my enlistment and then come back to the sheriff's office at that time.
Well, 31, 32, you're probably, hitting that top end for where you want to really be, knocking heads on a SEAL team.
Oh yeah. There was again, I was the old man going in. So you add 8 years on top of that. It definitely it was a great experience though. It was a great time. I still have a number of very, very good friends that I communicate with almost on a daily basis. And so it's a great fraternity or a great camaraderie that I wouldn't change for anything.
Well, anything you can tell us about there that's not, top secret?
Well, BUDS training, so much of what BUDS training is, I think the biggest part is going to be mental. And that's whenever I got actually retired from the sheriff's office, and I'm sure we'll touch on that in a few minutes, but I did a job for almost 6 months being a mentor or a recruiter for anyone that is wanting to join the Navy to do any one of the special warfare programs, whether that be explosive ordnance disposal, SEAL, Navy diver, things like that. And that's one of the things that I really tried to impress upon all of the candidates was that it's going to come down to just the mental aspect. You have to want it and you have to find a driving force. For me, shockingly, from DeSoto, there's a total of 3 Navy SEALs. We all grew up together. And so my driving force was the fact that I think that I would be limited on what I could do with those other 2 SEALs if I didn't complete the training, if I would be seen as a quitter or what it would be. And so that was the driving force I had. And everyone just needs to look internally and find out what they need to make themselves successful in anything that they challenge.
So were those guys from like our class time?
Oh, yeah. Dennis Bueller, Mike Haynes.
Okay. And then Dennis actually went to work for the sheriff's office as well.
He worked up in KCK for a while. Right. He was in the military, and then he worked for KCK.
So military veterans are often highly sought after in the corporate world. My son works for a large oil company, and they love hiring vets because of the discipline and leadership skills they bring with them. And there's really not more leadership involved than a SEAL team. What are some of the leadership skills that you learned in the Navy and as part of the SEALs that you've been able to apply to either law enforcement or just life in general?
Well, one, my kids got tired of hearing it growing up when they were growing up, but it was the intestinal fortitude. And that was to find out what your driving force is going to be, set your sights on a goal and make sure you can achieve it. I think most importantly, that's been beneficial for me is going to be the team aspect. You can get further working with a team than you can as an individual. And, there's the old saying, there's no I in team. And that's what they call it the SEAL teams for a reason, because even while I was at SEAL Team 3. I had a roommate, and there was 4 SEALs that we all lived together at a house down in south of Coronado. And one of them was at SEAL Team 1, another one at SEAL Team 5. We would kind of give each other a hard time every now and then about what their SEAL team was doing, which is typical. But the thing is that at any time, any of the SEALs could work together, and you could immediately become a cohesive unit. And I think that the same thing could be done if you look at law enforcement, if you look at any profession that someone's trying to do. If they work as a team, then they're going to get further.
Well, let's talk about law enforcement. So you left the SEALs, retired from military, and then came back in and came back on with the sheriff's office.
Yes.
So kind of walk us through your progression there. Because, you were at the sheriff's office for a couple, almost 3 decades, I think. And so you had a lot of different roles there. Kind of walk us through those.
Yeah, I came back to the sheriff's office in 1997. Fred Allenbrand was the sheriff. He was the sheriff whenever I was initially hired in 1987. And again, we knew the Allenbrand family growing up.
Right.
Then in 1997, after 2 years and then 8 years in the military, I came back in 1997. I worked in a number of different divisions while I was at the sheriff's office. I was in the detention bureau. I then worked in the court security division. I went to patrol, and I worked patrol division for a number of years and was actually promoted to the rank of sergeant and was a sergeant on patrol for 3 years. And then as a supervisor, I was transferred back to the detention bureau and worked in a number of areas there as a supervisor in the jail, the court services division, the training division for the detention center, and then the training division for the sheriff's office itself. I was then promoted to lieutenant. I worked in a number of different divisions, the warrant division, investigations division, patrol division as a lieutenant. And then in 2016, whenever the current sheriff, Cal Hayden, he was running for sheriff, he asked if I would be interested in joining his team to be the undersheriff. And so he won the election in 2016, November of 2016. And so then my stint as the undersheriff began in 2017.
Okay. So, a broad range of experience and across all ranges of the sheriff's office and just law enforcement in general. So talk to us about the role of a sheriff. What does a sheriff in Kansas actually do?
Well, the sheriff is going to be responsible for maintaining the jail, wherever that may be in the county, and then also serving civil process. So in civil process, as you know, it can be in a number of different areas, whether that's, for instance, someone's pay, if they're child support, or there's divorce proceedings, if they're required to appear in court, things like that. And then the sheriff can then monitor and kind of be an assistant or a backup, so to speak, for anyone throughout the entire county. And I think that's probably been one of the strengths for years with the sheriff's office, is just being able to work cohesively with all the city agencies, everyone work towards a common goal. There's 105 counties in the state of Kansas. There's 104 sheriffs.
Right.
The one is exempt on that is in Riley County out in Manhattan, Kansas, because they have a consolidated unit. But just like you said, it was voted on. It's always been an elected position, and then it was voted on through the state recently, and then it is now a change to the Kansas Constitution where the sheriff will remain an elected position, which I think is very key to the position.
No, I agree with that. So now I know that Johnson County also has a fairly extensive crime lab. Is that also under the sheriff's office aegis, or is that some other department?
No, that is the sheriff's office. There's a number of different divisions at the sheriff's office to include, like we said, detention, patrol, civil, warrants, investigations, things like that. Another area that you're talking about would be the communications division. That falls under the sheriff's office or the dispatch center,
right.
And then also the crime lab. And the Johnson County Criminalistics Laboratory, it is an amazing group. They are able to go to any crime scenes, and they are called out regularly, virtually on a daily basis, called out to handle any sort of crime scenes. They'll process the scenes, gather evidence, do everything that they need to do to find a suspect, identify victims, and everything like that with whichever case or investigation they're working.
Well, and it's amazing. I mean, this is probably more of a sideline, but it's just amazing how much more, in the CSI vein of things, how much more forensics has become a part of solving crimes, and electronic forensics as well, tracking cell phones, tracking vehicles, all that sort of stuff. You see that come up more and more and more in criminal trials. Well, we were able to play. I mean, we just saw it all in the thing in Georgia as far as tracking the cell phones, but that's ubiquitous. I mean, that gets used all the time these days.
Oh, you're exactly right. I don't think that it happens quite as quickly as it does on TV, on CSI. But yeah, the technology is just astounding whenever you talk about what can be found. And granted, you can see some of the TV shows that'll say, hey, this is what, like a true crime, and this is how they were able to solve the case. And you know what? The crime lab, Johnson County Crime Lab with the sheriff's office, they do an amazing job doing that. They have so many different units there also, whether it be the ballistics unit, for firearms, whether it be the fingerprints, whatever the case. And like you mentioned, as far as the computer analysis, the phones, the motor vehicles nowadays where they have computer chips and all of those, it's amazing the data and the technology that they can find.
So let's talk about the jail just a little bit, and we'll talk about bail issues later on. But I've got a stepbrother who recently passed away who was in the Army during Operation Iraqi Freedom. He had a number of guys who served under him who ended up committing suicide. And I know it tore him up each time he heard about that. I mean, because we talked about it and he was just, terribly stressed that there wasn't something what could I have done more to help these guys? I talked to him as much as I can. And I know most military people have had, similar experiences that someone that they know, just, PTSD or whatever, pushed them over the edge and they committed suicide. But that really does kind of touch on the issue of mental health, and mental health and policing is a big issue these days. I know that the legislature's looked at this recently, but both from a patrol standpoint and a jail standpoint. So we're looking at, do we have mental health first responders, and what sort of care can we give to people with mental health issues in the jail? What can the jail or the sheriff do to encourage mental health issues or address for people while they're in custody?
Well, I know that for years, whenever I was there as the undersheriff, then we were working hand in hand with Johnson County Mental Health, and that's recently changed. There is medical providers for any of the inmates that are in the detention center, and again, that's understandable. If somebody is in there, there's a duty and an obligation to make sure that they're provided the medical care that they're going to need, and in turn, additionally with that is going to be the mental health assistance or treatment that they're going to need. I think that it works out very well. I don't know how it's going to work currently by changing. I know with Johnson County Mental Health, it was very effective. And the reason why is that if you had somebody that was incarcerated and they were being treated by Johnson County Mental Health, say they're in jail for 6 months, hypothetically, and then they're released on a Sunday. Well, on Monday, they could immediately go back into the Johnson County mental health system because they're already entered into their system. They already have a counselor that they're working with. They already know their medications and things like that. And I think that helps out quite a bit, because then the very next day, somebody's able to get the treatment they need, and everything will continue as far as their mental health treatment. It'll be interesting to see, because I know just recently at the end of last year, it was voted on. The sheriff's office came out and said that they are now going to provide the mental health treatment for the inmates is going to be with the primary medical provider. And so I'm hoping that whenever somebody gets released on a Sunday, that within a very expeditious time that they are able to get into the Johnson County mental health system, that information, the data, who everybody is, what they're being treated for. Right. I hope that there's not a delay in that. And that's going to be the biggest concern.
So primary medical care provider like Prison Health Services are one of those agencies that provides, jail medical care?
Yes.
Okay. So, well, we'll see how that works. I mean, that's something. I mean, there's an argument there that jails are some of our largest mental health repositories in the country these days, just because, we've done away with a lot of involuntary commitments, and those people end up in custody. And of course, then people in the jail setting, sheriffs and stuff like that, really have to kind of pick up the slack there. And it's not really what you're trained for. But so Undersheriff, you were Undersheriff for, 3.5 or 3 years. And Undersheriff, 4.5. Okay. So Undersheriff is kind of like being sheriff without any of the glory, right? I mean, all the operational issues and problems land on your desk first before they make it upstairs.
Well, I tried, as the Undersheriff, you definitely try to be a good buffer for anything, whatever needs to go up or whatever needs to go down.
So, and obviously you're running for sheriff, but if you were elected sheriff, so you would already have the experience. You already know the ins and outs, the budgeting, managing a large organization. So it wouldn't be the sort of situation where you need 6 to 8 months to kind of get up to speed from a functional standpoint.
I think you're spot on. Like I said, I worked at the sheriff's office for 26 years, and I worked a number of different divisions. I'm very familiar with the workings of the detention center, the patrol division, even investigations in areas like that. And as the Undersheriff, then I was able to, for lack of better terms, I had a bird's eye view of everything that was going on within the organization. And I think that that's paramount, to be able to know how to handle certain situations that we were going to be exposed to. It was a great time while I was there, and I look forward to going back as the sheriff.
Well, I mean, and there's a lot of challenges there. Let me get to the uncomfortable part here, and it's sort of a long question, so I'll kind of get to this. So it was always my opinion that Sheriff Hayden selected you as his undersheriff for a couple of reasons. You were, and you still are, highly respected among the rank and file officers and the command staff. And looking at your law enforcement endorsements on your campaign website, it's a who's who of virtually every former member of the Johnson County Sheriff's Office. I'm looking at these names, and they're people that I know. I'm like, man, this is making me feel really old. These people are all retired. And at the time he was running, Calvin Hayden had retired and become a politician. He'd run for a county commissioner and won at a sort of a real weird situation. But anyway, he was county commissioner, and I think he needed somebody inside the department to help with the nuts and bolts, but not someone who'd been his superior prior to retirement. I mean, he was retired as a lieutenant, so he didn't want to pick some captain or something like that who'd been bossing him around before. And second, you had a deep connection with the Allenbrand family. And I know you mentioned Fred Allenbrand before, but for listeners who are unfamiliar with Johnson County, Fred Allenbrand was the sheriff here for 35 years. I mean, our entire childhood, he was the sheriff. Yes. He was very professional. He was a Republican, but he was nonpartisan. And he had a fabulous reputation. Could have won 3 more elections had his health not caught up with him. And I always assumed that Hayden would serve a couple of terms and then, sort of ride off into the sunset, and you would step in and take over as the new sheriff, but didn't work out that way. So as much as you want to talk about this, why did you leave the department when you left?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the things you were saying, especially growing up with the Allenbrand family. We grew up with his son. I graduated high school with his son, and as a matter of fact, I think he should be coming into town here within the next week or so. So I'm looking forward to seeing him again.
Well, tell hi.
I definitely will. The reason that I left is, let me back up just a second. That was exactly the plan, and right now I am moving forward with the same plan. Whenever I was the Undersheriff, is that the Cal was planning on doing 2 terms, and then he was going to go ahead and retire at that point. And then my goal was to then go ahead and campaign and hopefully get elected sheriff at that time. And so I'm staying consistent with the plan that we had back in fall of 2016, and then whenever we started in 2017. That was my goal all along, was to eventually be the sheriff. And again, a lot of that was because that was the environment that we grew up in. knowing who the sheriff was. Why I left, I think that the goals and the visions changed. Whenever we went in, we had a number of ideas and plans that we were moving forward with, and that was one of the biggest things, was to rebuild those relationships, or maybe re-enhance the relationships with the city police agencies, agencies across the state of Kansas, the county, the state, working with county government and doing whatever we could do. And I believe that those visions, all the goals and the direction that we were going, changed. And so that was one of the biggest reasons that I went ahead and retired. I purchased my military time back, or a portion of it. And so I had 32 years. So I retired with 32 years, knowing that a few years later, I was still planning on running for sheriff. And that's where we're at today.
So, just talking about your primary opponent, because if you win in the primary, you'll have a general election opponent, but we'll deal with that maybe on another podcast.
There we go.
Sheriff Hayden has kind of drawn the ire of the Kansas City Star and some members of the county commission by latching on to sort of what I guess has been termed as an election fraud investigation, which I think has finally come to an end. And but in my mind, it's important that the sheriff remain an independent elected official. And fortunately, that constitutional issue was passed through. And it just seems odd that the sheriff would be, I don't know, grandstanding over an election fraud claim. I mean, if there's real smoke, sure, look for the fire, no question. But there's a lot of cranks out there that would make calls and make claims, especially after the 2020 elections. And I'd never even heard that there was any sort of problem or indication of any sort of problem with the Johnson County Election Office, where, it's certainly not anything like we've heard in other parts of the country. But does this sort of thing, help or harm the department to kind of go off on this tangent?
I think that it has a tendency more to hurt the agency. I understand that the position of sheriff is very political. And
right.
As you mentioned early on in the podcast, it's an elected position that's done countywide. And so undoubtedly, it's going to be a political position. But where I see it is, I understand that there's politics involved, but I just wish that the agency or the office of the sheriff would not be so politicized. And what I mean by that is, like you mentioned, election fraud. Let me preface that by saying I'm not privy to any of the evidence that they
right.
say is out there. The biggest thing that I saw through the election fraud, or the biggest issues, is that the message seemed to change. One article you would read, they would say the comments were made, I'm going to be putting people in handcuffs. And then the very next article you read is like, well, I don't believe anything nefarious took place. And then the very next article, it changed every time. And because it seemed like there for a while, every other day or weekly anyhow, that there was a comment or something was being mentioned or said or discussed in the media, that it started to come down on the men and women of the Johnson County Sheriff's Office themselves. And I worked with them hand in hand, and they are some amazing, amazing people. And that's where I think it was the problem. As the undersheriff, I was able to handle a lot of issues. Whenever we were dealing with COVID, whenever we're dealing with drug issues, whatever the case may be. And the sheriff is still the sheriff. And so he was still able to go to all the political events. He was still able to go and speak to the different groups that needed to be spoken to. And then I would stay back and try to run everything like I felt that it needed to be run, or how he wanted it ran. And then I would just keep him in the loop. Right. I think by politicizing everything, then that puts everybody kind of in the spotlight. And I think that's the unfortunate part.
Well, and I saw a poll, actually may even be on your Facebook page, that the Johnson County Sheriff's residents on a poll had a 53% satisfaction rate with the sheriff's office. And, while you can say, in the current environment, maybe 53% is not so bad for law enforcement. It's not great, but but comparatively, they had a 68% satisfaction rate with the DMV, which if you compare it to that sounds pretty bad, considering, what everybody seems to think of the DMV. So if you're not standing up against the DMV, what can be done to change this public perception of the sheriff's office?
And again, I think that gets back to the emphasis and the focus that I would put on even through the SEAL teams, and that's the teamwork. I think everyone working together. if you can work with a number of different police agencies and everybody can come together on a common goal, I mean, it doesn't matter if you're talking about the sheriff's office, if you're talking about a city police agency, the goals are virtually going to be the same. You want to protect the citizens in your community, and you want to put bad people in jail. And then there's going to be some minutia that's on the outside, and I understand that. I completely agree. I think that the sheriff's office, the 53%, hey, you know what? You're right there in the middle. The bad part on the same survey, if you look, I think it was page 6 or 7, that it said the same on the same survey, the area that the people that were polled believed needed the most, or the biggest area of improvement, was the sheriff's office. And so I think that those are the things that need to be looked at and need to be reevaluated to try to get everybody working together. I think if everyone works together, has a good teamwork, then we're going to be more successful in what we try to do.
So what are the big issues facing Johnson County from a law enforcement perspective?
Well, one of the biggest, I would say, is drugs. Yeah. You know, you can look at the drugs, and that's an easy thing to bring up, but it's a monumental issue that's taking place. Everybody would agree, and I think you could go from state to state and recognize that, like, the I-35 corridor is going to be a big avenue to get drugs up here to the Midwest and get them spread throughout the United States. Excuse me. That being the case, I believe that what we need to do is really focus on the drug issues that we have here in Johnson County. While I was there as Undersheriff, we created a drug task force. The drug task force is doing an amazing job. They're pulling drugs off of the streets literally on a daily basis. The unfortunate part about it is that there's 17 police agencies in Johnson County, excluding the sheriff's office. So 17 city police agencies, only one is participating in the drug task force. And of the 7 cities that are touching I-35, none of those are participating. And I think it just comes down to trying to rebuild those relationships, try to get everybody looking at the common goal. As good as the drug task force is doing right now, can you imagine how much better they would be if they had another 16 people on that unit? They would just be doing an amazing job keeping the citizens safe.
Well, again, you don't really think about it, but it doesn't take that many officers to make a huge impact in what's going on, especially in something like drugs, when you have a distribution type network. I mean, when we're not talking, marijuana sort of things, when we're talking about people dying of fentanyl overdoses. I mean, I've had at least 4 clients that I'm aware of that overdosed on fentanyl after they were out. I mean, and that's just, when people come in, I'm talking to them, hey, family, hey, this is how you can get Narcan. This is, you can get it for free, in the naloxone zone. If you think your child has this sort of problem, get some, keep some in the house. I mean, keep it around to where you've got access to that just in case, for your own personal safety. If you're mid-20s kid has an opioid problem, you should probably have some in the house just in case you're accidentally exposed. Now,
yes,
one of the things that's going around, currently in the current environment that a lot of law enforcement is suffering through is finding enough people to work. I know that in areas of the state like Wichita, both the Wichita PD and the sheriff are essentially fighting over a limited pool of officer recruits. I mean, they keep raising their rates, trying to pull people away from either one. Yeah. How's that working locally? I mean, you said 17 different cities in Johnson County plus the sheriff's office. Are there enough people to pull from to keep these departments staffed?
I think that, it'll work its way out. And what I mean by that is the sheriff's office, they were able to give a significant pay raise, well-deserved pay raise to their staff this past year. Now what you're going to see is the trickle-down effect. As soon as the pay goes up for one agency, and then the next 2, 3, 4, 5 agencies are going to try to do the same to at least match it or surpass that. It is amazing how, and you mentioned it, Wichita down to the Sedgwick County area, how whenever they make an adjustment, then how everyone's just, literally robbing from Peter to pay Paul. And that's I think that there's a lot of people out there. There's a lot of people that they still want to serve. And that's going to be, I think that's a testament to our community, and that's a testament to us as a humanity. So if we can continue to get the pay up, it's a difficult job. It's not for the faint of heart, because if you truly look at law enforcement in today's day and age, and it doesn't matter if you're talking about a large agency like the sheriff's office, Overland Park, any of these in Johnson County or Wichita or wherever the case may be, if you look at those, every officer is now expected to be, have a very strict discipline with use of force. They need to be a mental health expert, probably be a psychologist at the same time, depending on the call for service that they're out. So there's a lot of duties and responsibilities that each and every one of them have to have. And it takes a special person to do it. But I think that the pendulum, it may swing back a little bit, and it will get, in my opinion, corrected to where people want to serve and they won't have that problem anymore.
Well, let's hope. I mean, we've had discussions with other people. Joe Gamaldi, who's the FOP vice president. We talked to him a few episodes ago, and he was very concerned about getting enough officers in and lowering standards. So, the sheriff's office in Johnson County patrols us as a patrol division, and you worked in that patrol division, and they patrol kind of a smaller area, basically the unincorporated areas of the county. So
correct.
How can the sheriff make a difference in crime prevention and deterrence when they're really only engaged in patrolling a small area of the county? So what can the sheriff's office do?
Yeah, the sheriff's office, and then they also contract with the cities of DeSoto and Edgerton, and so they do their policing network. But everything on the western side of Johnson County and the southern part, if you kind of go around Gardner, go around Spring Hill, and things like that, and those are the primary areas. I think one of the biggest things that they need to do is, again, and I'm going to beat this dead horse, I guess, is work cohesively with the city agencies. I think that we can work as a team. The sheriff's office does do a number of policing activities up in the cities in Johnson County. If you're talking about the civil division to serve the civil papers, the warrant division, the drug task force, the crime lab. And so I think areas like that, it's very good for what they do. I think that if we get back into, and again, you mentioned it very early on in the podcast, into the Fred Allenbrand regime. And I think one of the biggest things that Fred did was he kind of liked to be what appeared to me as a 21, 22-year-old kid, was that he wanted to be the silent professional, is that he said, hey, the sheriff's office is here. We will be here for anything you need. If you need backup, if you need assistance, we will be here to support you in any way that we possibly can. And then when the job is done, then just back off and let the cities then run the cities how they feel that it needs to be done. Right. And I think if we get back into a policing technique like that, I think it'll be very effective.
Well, let's talk about the jail a little bit. Jail population's been down since COVID. I know we, like every place else, we kicked a bunch of people out the door, and I think we're to a certain extent paying some of the price now. I think we're a couple 300, criminal cases above what we were, the year before COVID as far as case filing. Some of that's just playing catch up, and some of it's just an increase in crime. But we're still seeing the courts kind of continue that revolving door policy on a lot of crime issues. I mean, we're seeing a whole lot more signature bonds. A lot of people, you're seeing bonds, people that we've brought back in a week later, they're turning around and letting them go again. Like, well, didn't you just learn your lesson, courts? That we already had to bring them in once. But can the sheriff have an impact on that? And how does repeatedly having to arrest the same people over and over and over again and then have the court just kick them out the door on signature bonds, how does that impact officer morale or community safety?
Oh, that can be frustrating, because like you said, you're seeing it on your side, in your profession, is it's going to be the same person time and time and time again, the revolving door. And that gets frustrating. Even whenever I was in the detention center as a younger deputy, whenever we would see the same person, everyone would know who this is. And they would say, oh, my gosh, is so-and-so back in jail again? We're all surprised about that. I think that it would come down to a good conversation. Hopefully the district attorney, I think Steve Howe, he's done a very good job. But a lot of that, the decision of what a bond's going to be set at or no bond or whatever the case may be, it's going to be up to the judicial system. And I think just continuing to have those conversations, I think in Johnson County, we have a very good judicial system, DAs. I think everyone works well together, but I think anything can be improved improved, because as you said, if somebody is coming in and out of jail, even depending on the crime that they're doing, it may just be a matter of time before it turns more violent or the citizens aren't safe. And that's the biggest key that we need to look at.
Well, and the last podcast we did was with Jeff Reisig from Yolo County, California, and what he'd done some studies showing that the people that were released on zero bail during COVID and compared their recidivism rates to the people who'd been released the year prior to that and on actual bonds, and he was showing that the people that were released on the zero bail had, I think it was 163% more crime committed by those individuals specifically, and 200% more violent crime. So, I mean, there was, I'll get into that a little bit further because I've got another kind of, we should probably, spin this around to bail just a little bit since it's a bail podcast. One aspect that I've heard, we're still talking about jail, some of the cities complain, I talked to Judge in Olathe, was the limitations on how many detainees they can see over video at any given day. I think the complaint was that we could only see maybe 2 or 3 max. And then the cities, if they could only see those people to make an evaluation on those people, then they were forced to release pretty much everybody else who was there. If they were just brought 5 people in on warrants for failure to appear, and if I can only see 2, I'm going to maybe pick and choose these 3 that I can tell from here, deal with them, and then I got to give release orders to these other people because I can't get them in front of the judge fast enough. Absent sending an officer down to physically take them from the jail, transport them to the city, and arraign them, which none of the cities are doing anymore.
Sure.
I mean, do we have enough video rooms or just enough staff in the jail to handle that sort of stuff? Or, how can issues like that be addressed? I know that's kind of a specific issue, but
sure. No. Yeah. I actually hadn't heard that was an issue going on with the city judges. I know that there is a video court in both detention centers in Olathe and then also out at New Century. And so that worked out really well. Years ago, the city would actually send, the city agency, they would send, like if it was Olathe Court or Overland Park, whatever the case, they would send an officer down and they would actually kind of manage the court proceedings of what they wanted to do. The staff in the detention center would be there to do everything that they needed to do, bring the inmates down, whatever the case. But then they would have an officer there to say, okay, now we need to see inmate A, inmate B, inmate C, and go from there.
Right.
And I think that changed a few years ago. Probably comes down to staffing.
Right.
But yeah, that's one of the biggest things. And I think that could easily be corrected. What they may want to do is just have a good discussion and say, hey, what days are they going to have court? And again, I'm not that familiar with it. I've been gone for, 3 years. Right. But if they're all showing up for court on Monday or Wednesday or whatever the case may be, maybe the courts could change and some of them could spread that out to Tuesday and Thursday instead of Monday and Wednesday, and then just make it more user friendly for everybody.
So you were talking about the drug task force, and one of the questions I had here was basically has the level of cooperation dropped off between sheriff's office and local agencies? So what can be done, or what is causing these agencies to say no, I realize drugs are a problem, but we're not going to participate in your drug task force. What's going on there? How did that fall off? Because I know in the past they've been hand in glove working together with a lot of these, particularly on drug issues, because they span across these cities. So you need to have an agency that kind of can coordinate across cities. How does that come into play now?
And what is the cause of that, or why, for lack of better terms, why everyone isn't playing? I have my suspicions of why that's taking place, but what we'd have to sit and visit with the chiefs and to find out what their mindset or what their drive is behind it. But again, I think it would come down to if everyone works together. If I'm sure that there's always going to be that concern of saying, man, do we want to have our staff, our an officer working for the sheriff's office? How is that going to be? Who is going to be in control? Who's the supervisor of this unit? Things like that. Because it doesn't matter what agency you're talking about. Everyone wants to make sure that they do if they are an employee of whatever police agency you want to choose, that is their employee and we're not giving them to the sheriff's office. But I think if they would have a good, serious discussion and say, hey, look, this is what are we trying to do here? What is our goal here? And again, in law enforcement, you're going to continue to bring it up to say our goal is to keep the citizens of Johnson County safe. And I think that if there can be a very good conversation to say, hey, what is going to be the goal? Let's work together to make it happen, then it could be righted very quickly.
Well, and I mean, it's not like there's not models to work off. I mean, the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force, pulls officers from all kinds of different agencies to work in that group and looking for people that, violent crimes, essentially, that people have warrants for those violent crimes. So, I mean, there's certainly a model that they could work from.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. And, so then it just comes down to where they're going to be working at. Now, it may be just as easy as somebody saying, well, we are from this city. I don't know that I'd necessarily want my personnel working in this city or this jurisdiction, whatever the case may be. But the thing about the drugs is that there's a lot of fingers with the drugs. It may come up I-35, but even coming up I-35, then it's going to be, the drugs are going to be spread out all through all of Johnson County, throughout the entire Kansas City metro area. And so I think if everyone would work together to try to make that happen, and I know that I'm continually saying, let's work together, but I think teamwork is the key to anything.
Well, one other hot button issue here, I've got them in my notes here. It gets brought up a lot, and I don't think it's probably a fair assessment, but there's been a lot of criticism from certain segments about the so-called militarization of the police. So as someone who's seen both the military side of things and the police side, is it a fair assessment that the police have become more military-minded, or have they gone overboard with military-type hardware?
In my opinion, no. I don't think that that's a fair assessment. And the reason why is because, years ago, everyone had a revolver. And so then you wanted to make sure that you could at least have something to match the person. If you're involved in any sort of a conflict, if they had a revolver, you had a revolver, well, you may want to go ahead and put a shotgun in play also. Right. Nowadays, there's a lot of firearms out there. There's a lot of people that have whatever type of weapon that they may have. And you want to make sure you keep your people safe. That's what it comes down to. I understand where people say the militarization, but at the same time, if that person ends up calling 911, they're going to want the sheriff or the police to show up with every bit of equipment they have to keep them safe. And I don't think that would be fair to the men and women with any police agency to say, hey, you know what? We understand you're going to be going into a very dangerous situation, but we are going to give you this equipment because it's more cosmetically appealing. Not so much that it will do the job for you, but it won't get people upset or triggered in doing that. And I just think anything we can do to keep people safe.
Yeah, forget that Kevlar. Here's some paper mache you can put on.
There, exactly. It doesn't quite work out like that. And ultimately, I don't care if you're the sheriff, if you're a chief of police, even if you're a city administrator, you want your people to come home safe. And you want to give them the equipment and the materials that they're going to need to make sure that happens. And it would be no different than if somebody is working in public works for a city agency. You're not just going to give them a shovel. You're probably going to give them a backhoe to do the work.
Well, if you want anything actually done, yeah. Good point. So let's talk about bail a little bit. I mean, it's a bail bond podcast, so I should probably touch on that. You've worked in several roles where you could see bail up close. I mean, you obviously worked in detention. You had dealings with both bail bondsmen and defendants in that role. In the warrants division, you had to work at catching people with warrants. Sometimes there were people who hadn't missed court, and sometimes there were people who had. And as a patrol officer, you had to initially arrest the people that we bondsmen were later posting bond for. So just kind of expand on what your thoughts are about the role of the professional bail bondsman in the pretrial process. Is it the type of thing that works well when it's allowed to, or are you a zero bail kind of guy, or kind of someplace in the middle?
No, I think that the bail program, I think that it's very effective for the way that we do it. I can still remember years ago, this was before I went to the military when I worked at the sheriff's office. There were a number of them, they did not have a preset bail or a bond for instance, a DUI. Right. And if somebody was arrested on a Friday afternoon and they missed first appearances on Friday, they didn't go to court again until Monday afternoon. And so they sat there the entire weekend. Then whenever I came back back from the military, then suddenly it was like, oh, hey, they have these preset bonds, which I thought was an ingenious idea, because it allowed the people to get out of jail, or, some of them, it allowed them to sober up before they got out of jail. I think. I think that the bail, I think that it's a very effective process. I think that the judge, they don't necessarily have to go with the amounts, is the way I understand it. You would definitely know more than me, but they don't have to say, hey, it's cut and dry. The bond is going to be this much money. And I understand the argument when they say, well, the people that are lower income, poverty levels, things like that, they may not have the same opportunities to bond out. But at the same time, on the law enforcement aspect, I've always thought it was very frustrating when there was no bail or no bond, and you read stories about this nationwide where somebody is going to get booked into jail for what seems to be a pretty serious crime, and they are out the door before the officers even finish their report. And that's when it becomes, in the law enforcement side, I think it would be very easy for people to say, my gosh, why do we even bother? Because if the courts don't care, if the district attorneys don't care, we're out here trying to do our job. We need a little help on our side. And
then you have your crime victims who are like, wait a second, this guy just went to jail 2 hours ago, now he's right back here, and so then you have victims of crime that are now afraid to make the reports because the person, nothing's going to happen. So we don't report the crime. And so it just, things fall. I mean, that was the experience in Philadelphia when we looked at some old reports there, their dismissal rates, the more people they let go, the higher and higher their dismissal rates got. And a lot of that was because the victims then started refusing to show up to testify against the people that victimized them.
Yes.
So another question I ask on bond, and I've asked this, I've passed three podcasts because it's been posed to me a few times. So I try and get, people who are work in this line of work, get their take on it. The bail reformers often make the argument that since most people manage to secure their release eventually, and most people do get out in one fashion or another, that it really doesn't matter how they get out. If someone gets out on a signature bond, it doesn't matter if they commit a terrible crime once they're out, because they would have done the same thing if they were released on a financial bail. Now, of course, the data, like that Yolo County study I referenced earlier, doesn't support this. But the question I ask is, in kind of people that work in this field, is why does financial bail release work? I mean, it does work. Both reduces failures to appear and reduces overall crime, and many other types of pretrial release, zero bail, cite and release, they seem to have the opposite effect. But, the argument is, if it's the same people getting out, wouldn't you expect the same behavior regardless of the type of release? As someone who's worked in this field, what are your thoughts about why it actually does work?
I think that it works because, for lack of better terms, they have a skin in the game. A signature, I'm proud of my signature. It's pretty sloppy if you try to read it, but I can sign something. But then if they turn around, and if it was me getting into my bank account and then calling up a bail bondsman and they say, okay, we need a certain percentage, and I put money onto that percentage, then, like I said, they've invested something in the product, so to speak, and the product is going to be their freedom. At the same time, depending on the severity of the crime, if the bond's a lot higher, it's not uncommon for people to get a hold of a family member, get a hold of a friend, and they say, hey, you know what, I can put my house, I can put this, I can put that up as for bond. So then suddenly they're going to make sure that person shows up, he or she show up for court, because again, now someone else has a vested interest in what's taking place. And that's where I think the key is.
Well, and also if you have, when you have the family members involved, they can also make the decision not to get the person out, particularly as you referenced drugs being a major problem, major driver of crime. A lot of times it's not a good idea to kick somebody right out the door, if you have an ongoing drug problem. I mean, let's get you sobered up. Let's get you into help. A lot of times the family won't come get you out, or if they do, they'll make it conditional upon you doing something else. Okay, now, yes, I'll come get you out, but we're going to rehab. You're going to get a job. You're going to take some steps to get that person back on track society-wise, versus we're just going to continue straight down this downward spiral that we're on. Because if that's the case, a lot of times the family's like, no, you can stay right where you're at.
I think that you're spot on, because the good part about, and speaking on behalf of the Johnson County Sheriff's Office, the detention center, I know that there's all kinds of treatment that people can get, and we touched on the mental health that they can get earlier. The good part about that is I have seen people that they've made the transition. They come in, they're an alcoholic, they're a drug addict, whatever the case may be, and after they're there for a certain period of time, whenever they get out, and granted, it's going to be a fork in the road the second they walk out. Right. Which way am I going to go? Am I going to continue on this path that, unfortunately, or however they look at it, for lack of better terms, was forced on them because they were forced to get sober for the last months, years, whatever the case may be? Or am I going to revert back to the way that I was? Families, as you know much better than I, they can revoke someone's bond, or they can contact you and say, hey, I don't know for sure the numbers, how often that happens. You would know that. I wouldn't know that. But the options are there. I think that anything that can be done to, again, have somebody working, whether that through a bail bondsman, through their family, whatever the case, through the courts. Let's also think about the fact if somebody signs a bond and then they leave, well, then, for instance, you being in the bail industry, if you put up somebody's bail and then all of a sudden they skip out on court, the courts are going to call you, the sheriff's office, and say, hey, guess what? There's a warrant for this person, but they're also going to call you and they're going to try to hold you accountable. So you have a vested interest in getting that person back to court.
Right. And so then we have a focused attention on that one individual, whereas the Sheriff's Department Warrants Division, they may have hundreds, if not thousands of people they have to deal with, and they'll deal with them as they come along. But that bonding company is going to be very much hyper-focused on that one individual.
Yes.
So let's wrap it up a little bit. I mean, I've kept you here for quite a while. So primary election is August the 6th?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so you got about 4 months to convince everybody that that this is the new wave.
I'm doing my best.
That's a lot of districts to walk. When I went through Leadership Olathe, they talk about, politically walking your district's the best way. I don't know if you can walk the district for a county of 600,000 people.
I'll have my watch on. I'll get my steps in. That's for certain through all of that.
So your website is DougBedfordForSheriff.com, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and so you can donate or volunteer there if people wanted to support your campaign. I think you're running a Facebook page as well that has lots of info.
Doug Bedford for Sheriff.
Okay, all right. We'll try and link both of those at the end of the podcast here. So, well, Doug, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. It certainly sounds like you definitely have the support of the law enforcement professionals. But like many races, especially races that are sort of particular niche type races, it's really important to get your message out to the ordinary voter. And best of luck the next few months. Hopefully we'll see, at least hopefully from your perspective, we will see a new sheriff in office here come next year.
Shane, I appreciate it. It's it's been a long haul at this point. Like I said, I have 28 years law enforcement now experience, and then again 8 years as a Navy SEAL. I think that I have the tools that it takes to get the job done and to get people to work as a team together, and I think that's going to be key. But this has been a great experience. I've never done a podcast, so I can't say that tomorrow.
Well, you should certainly sign up for a lot more of them. It's a great way to get your message out.
I love it. Shane, thank you very much.
Thank you for taking the time, Doug. We would like to thank our guest, Doug Bedford, for taking the time to speak with us today. Doug has spent his entire adult life in some type of public service in either the military or law enforcement and is hoping to return to public life as sheriff. If you would like to support Doug, you can visit his website or Facebook page. And we hope that you'll join us on the next episode of the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we'll continue to bring you conversations with people involved in the criminal justice system.
For more information about Doug Bedford, please visit his website, DougBedfordForSheriff.com, and on Facebook at Facebook.com/DougBedfordForSheriff. Join us again next time for the Bail in the Midwest podcast, hosted by Shane Rolf.